All right, welcome back to another episode of the Future Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Ilser. This month, we're talking about a major concern for city dwellers all around the globe, air quality. Air pollution is a major health risk, with more than 4 million people dying each year from exposure to outdoor air pollution. Understanding the various components of air quality can help us to manage and improve it. Today, we'll be talking with a scientist from Villanova University about his research on microbes and air quality in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest, Justin Stewart, to the show. Welcome, Justin.
Hi. As Stephen said, I'm Justin. I live in Philadelphia and I study the atmospheric microbiome and fine particulate matter in the air. It's kind of different from what I started out as. I started out in Austin, Texas, studying microbes in soil, doing very theoretical work. And I've kind of moved to this whole applied thing. But microbes are awesome. So that's what we're here for today.
Microbes are awesome. So I guess what caused you to make that transition from soils to air, from theoretical to applied? What made you want to make that change?
Okay, don't get me wrong. I do love theoretical. I was working on some information today on like how are microbes assembled into these weird communities. But I've found that they do so much. They're really, really integral to something nutrient cycling and human health and basically everything, and they're everywhere. So I was like, how can I take all this knowledge that I'm learning and use it in a way that can actually help people or be better to understand like environmental health, as opposed to just looking at what they're doing in the soil and then being like, cool, we know how much nitrogen they're moving, but we're not going to do anything about that now that we know it. So I went from the soil to the air kind of interestingly. I had no idea what I was going to do. I was graduating and freaking out. I was like, oh my God, do I have to get a job? But I started talking to labs, and I read this one really interesting paper by this man, Noah Fear and Bauer, and they collected all these microbes from the air in Colorado. And I was like, oh, microbes are in the air. I never thought about that despite doing microbial ecology for 3 years. And it's a really understudied field. I was like, okay, cool. I can do it. No one will tell me I'm wrong because no one knows what's going on yet. Let's jump into this.
Yeah, that is funny. I've never really thought too much about microbes being in the air either. It seems like that's a pretty extreme environment for microbes. I normally think about them in like moist, warm soil doing their thing, but are they thriving in the air?
So I'm going to answer this two ways. Microbes are everywhere. So there's a lot of really interesting research coming about how microbes can live in these things called acid mine drains. So like where the pH is 2. So it's incredibly harsh for something to live in, but stuff is living there. So they live everywhere. It's absurd. And so there are a lot of them in the air. From my study, I've found 15,000 specific different microbes in the air, but there's also other studies that have shown there's up to 10 to the 6th, so about 1 million microbes.
Holy cow.
In like 1 cubic meter of air or so. And just to like put that into context, it's a lot less than soil, where there's like the same amount in about 1 gram of soil. So it's orders of magnitude different based off their volume, but there's still a lot of them in the air. And the interesting thing is we know what they're doing in soil. It's really easy to just go and scoop it up, and then what we'll do is we'll take it and we'll sequence its DNA or its RNA, and then look at like what proteins are being expressed or do these assays with them. It's really hard to do that with the microbes in the air, because the majority of them we can't culture, like we can't grow them on a petri dish. So we use molecular biology. So we look at their ribosomes and kind of identify them based off of that, because if people don't know, ribosomes are basically the part of a cell that makes a protein. Everything has to have protein. So if you don't have a protein, you're not going to be alive. So me and other microbial ecologists, especially ones in the air, we look at the differences in the genetic sequences of it and then figure out what the organism is that. And then another thing we do is we look at that's just looking to identify what it is, because you can't really define a species of a microbe. Like E. coli is like 10,000 different organisms, and they all can be incredibly different from each other. So that one part can be the same, but so then we look at the whole genome, and like we see, okay, cool. Are there genes coding for carbon metabolism? Are they coding for tuberculosis? Are they coding for the Vibrio cholerae pathogenic cycle? What are the specific genes in them? But the other issue is we don't know if they're being expressed in the air because we can't successfully take them from the air and then do experiments on the ground because they won't survive. So it's very difficult.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be a challenge, and sounds like it'd just be maybe talking about like the difference in scale of magnitude of how many microbes are in the air versus how many microbes are in the soil and other surfaces. This must be pretty hard to actually collect an appreciable amount to actually like do your experiments with. Is that
That
sort of a fair assessment?
it okay. I just made a joke video about this where I ran around on my roof with a trash bag pretending to collect all the microbes from the air. Um, if anyone wants to see that, that's on my Twitter. But we actually collect them with these like air pumps, and they get deposited onto these little filters, kind of like the filter that you have in your AC unit. And so, I mean, I collected them for 3 days straight at a time, and that constituted one sample. And I found about 5,000 different species on there, ranging from about 1,000 to 300,000 cells. So it's they're in lower quantities, and they're difficult to get, mostly because they're dispersed so much. The wind moves them so fast that they're very, very random and stochastic, and also a lot of different like weather and seasonal variation changes that. So yeah, it's not the easiest sampling. I was recently going to drop off or collect samples on a roof in downtown Philadelphia on the roof of Temple University, and we have to get on a subway, and then we get weird looks on the subway. Then we climb up on a roof and we put up either a bunch of petri dishes, and it's difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, I think during doing urban ecology, I think you always get sort of strange looks, which is part of
So
the
many.
fun.
Oh yeah.
So, as I mentioned earlier, you're at Villanova University, and for those who don't know, that's near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I was hoping to take a little bit of time here at the beginning to talk a little bit about the city. So Philadelphia, or Philly as it's commonly known, is one of the oldest cities in the U.S., dating all the way back to 1682. It's been at the center of many important historical events for the U.S., including the signing of the Declaration of Independence. About 1.5 million people live there, making it the sixth most populous U.S. city, although the population has actually declined since its peak around 2 million in 1950. But I've never actually been to Philly. Could you tell us a little bit more about what it's like there and what it's like to live there?
Yeah. So New York people don't get mad. A lot of people say it's like a smaller New York City in the center. We actually call it Center City. It is very unique in that it's like the second most densely populated like urban center in the country. There's about 190,000 people living in 2 square miles. So it's a really good proxy for super dense urban cores. And so that's one reason why I'm doing this study here. I also am studying out at Villanova, which is much more suburban. But aside from that, Philly has a very unique, special culture that's been shaped a lot by the fact that its population is declining. It is the poorest of all the major U.S. cities, actually. I'm of the top, 10 U.S. major cities. And there's a lot of both wealth inequality here, as well as socioeconomic stratification of where people live. Aside from that, we are heavily in the education sector, and we do have a lot of industry. Recently, you all may have heard, I don't know if this, I mean, it probably was on the news, but we had an oil refinery, I believe it was an oil refinery, like explode in the city. So
Wow.
there's a lot of, we're a unique place. Highly recommend coming and come here eating a cheesesteak. It's good. You'll love it. Great art, but she's special. Yeah.
um, Great. So, could you also maybe speak about maybe compare like living in Philadelphia versus other places that you lived? You said you lived in Austin as well.
Philadelphia is, as I was mentioning, it's much more urban and dense than Austin, Texas was, although Austin is still urban. I was actually just doing a measure of green space in Austin versus Philadelphia for my thesis, so I can compare to show that not all cities are the same. Philadelphia has one very large continuous area of green space, while Austin, Texas, and a lot of other cities that are kind of newer than Philadelphia have green space that's a lot more, I don't know how to, equally dispersed throughout the city. So a lot more parks and stuff. Philly is mostly a concrete jungle. But we do have a really, really good public, well, I think it's good, public transit system of really good trolleys, buses, and oh my gosh, subways that are lacking from a lot of other cities in the US, like Austin. Obviously, it's not as hot as Texas, which is heavily welcomed. But in addition to that, one thing I would say is there is a lot of social injustice with the structure of this city as opposed to Austin, Texas. And I think that's based on a lot of like the historical contingencies of how people moved here, and like the structure of all the where all the wealthy people live in Austin, Texas, are kind of dispersed throughout the whole city. While there is a very specific area of Philadelphia here where it's a lot of the wealthy people, called the Main Line. So we have this unique structure that honestly is, I have not seen replicated in many other cities. I've been through all throughout the US and a bit in other parts of the world. And Philly has, that's one reason I'm very happy to be studying it here. Oh, one other thing I should mention. Our dense urban core, Center City, there's skyscrapers. But then it's kind of like Paris in that there's the rest of the city, there's not a building over 5 stories, except for this one collection of probably like 20 skyscrapers. So we're very unique in that way. We have very, very specific zoning laws that are not repeated in places like Dallas, or if you know anything about Houston, Texas, they have no zoning laws. So they just have skyscrapers everywhere. So, and we also one thing I do really like about Philadelphia is they very much, we find the history of the city very integral to our identity. So we actually try really hard not to tear down old buildings. And there's a bit of city ordinance about that, as opposed to the lack of that in cities in Texas that I've been in.
So I know, so Philly, as you mentioned, is this has areas that are very, very dense, lots of people living there, and that means that there has been some issues with air quality. I know in 2017, Philly received an ozone grade of an F and a 24-hour particle pollution rating of D from the American Lung Association. That number of the number of high ozone days is actually lower now than when compared to 2001, down from 50 days per year to fewer than 10. So could you tell us a little bit about some of the causes of these air quality issues in the city, and what has potentially changed to lower that number of high ozone days?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to address the ozone first. So to give people a framework, ozone is literally 3 oxygen molecules that are connected to each other. There's both anthropogenic, meaning it comes from human activity, and ozone that also is not, we'll say natural. That's that, is kind of the earth is responsible for creating itself. And the interesting thing about it is the anthropogenic ozone is stratified lower in like the height of the atmosphere. So it's closer down to us, as opposed to the ozone that is up higher in the atmosphere, which is used to block out solar radiation. So the issue we have is a lot of industrial activity, which Philadelphia does have a lot. It's kind of sequestered in the south. I'm having to do like never eat soggy waffles. Southwest corner of Philadelphia. There's a lot of industrial activity. And so just to be very basic with it, when nitrogen and volatile organic carbon, so that's like literally small sugars or carboxylic acids, interact with sunlight, so specifically UVA and B, in the air, it creates ozone. And so that normally is not an issue if it's up high in the atmosphere, but since it's coming from these anthropogenic sources, it's coming lower in the atmosphere, and it's affecting human health and ecosystem services. So to address the human health, it's mostly causing asthma and respiration issues. Surprisingly, not a lot of cancer, but also lung scarring, which is something that I found terrifying. And then another thing that I want to talk about is ecosystem services, which are these benefits that you derive from an ecosystem. They're things that you might not even be thinking about. There's like intrinsic ones like, access to clean water, fresh air, And then there's also ones like genetic biodiversity of soil and genetic biodiversity of the microbes in the air. So this ozone has repercussions for a lot of different ecosystem services. One is biomass. The greater concentrations of the ozone at lower areas of the atmosphere, so like down where we are, it actually impedes photosynthetic rates of these plants. So it has all these other downstream effects. So we have less biomass, and having more biomass and plant material in cities, especially ones that are urban and dense. Philadelphia is incredibly important. There's this thing called the heat island effect. The solar radiation goes to the concrete and it gets hot, very hot, that I did not expect. And these urban green spaces are very, very good at mitigating that. So a lot of research has been done on that in New York City and Berlin, interestingly. One of my labs at my university, the Kramer lab, does a lot of research on that. And Philly doesn't have a lot of urban green spaces. So the effects of the ozone are a little bit stronger here. We have 4 planned parks as well as that one large green space. But those 4 planned parks I just mentioned are the ones that are in the deep urban core where you really need this biomass. So the fact that we've gone down from those 50 days to 10 is really great improvement. The other thing is this ozone is really hard to get source appointment from. So we don't really know where it's coming from. Ozone can travel hundreds of miles. So interestingly, like a lot of the ozone that has been produced in industrial activities in New Jersey, that ozone has been traced to move out to the Midwest, for example, or something.
Wow.
So we don't really know where it's all coming from. So that's one of the major issues with ozone. I actually focus on something called particulate matter, like you were discussing. We have a very bad rating of particulate matter in Philadelphia. So there's 2 types. There's ones that's called PM10, that's fine. So like it's, no, that's coarse, excuse me. It's 10 micrometers for about, to give the example, it's like a little smaller than the width of a human hair. And that's a lot of just broken up particles that are in the air, and we have a lot of them. We also have even more PM 2.5, which is the worst one, that is 2.5 micrometers in size and smaller in the air. So just to clarify, PM 10 includes PM 2.5, but PM 2.5 is so bad for health. There's this very famous Harvard 6 City study that over, I think it was 30 years, they found a direct linear relationship between the concentration of fine particulate matters in cities in the US and the rate of mortality and morbidity of humans. So there was this was one of the really large pushes of the Clean Air Act, as well as ozone. And Philadelphia, one of the reasons it's improving is they have kind of been a little bit more stringent with adhering to the Clean Air Act in the last few years, specifically because people are paying a lot more attention to it. More labs in Philadelphia are now doing the research. And so the research that we're doing, we actually bring it to the EPA and we're like, hey, are you aware that the values are like 3 times what they should be? The daily average should be around below 30 micrograms per cubic meter, but I have found some days where we can hop up to 70. And the yearly average is supposed to be around 12. Wait, you might want to flip those. Anyway, it's high and bad. And so we're trying to really understand that. And so I'm going to go into talk about what PM 2.5 is, because that's mostly what I focus on.
Yeah,
it's made of it's made largely of carbon. So this thing called black carbon, which is soot, essentially. The same soot that killed a lot of people in London during the Industrial Revolution. So it's around 30% that, and then a lot of it's made of inorganic ions. So calcium and sorry, not calcium. What am I trying to say? Nitrate, fluoride, chloride, and calcium, magnesium, as well as heavy metals. So that's one of the things that people are really worried about, because if there's the presence of these heavy metals in the air and we're breathing them in, what are they going to do to us? So heavy metals are things like cadmium, chromium, arsenic, really bad things that you don't want to be breathing in, that are cancer causing. And so this PM 2.5 also includes microorganisms. This part of PM 2.5 is kind of overlooked a lot. So there's only been like 6 studies in the United States that have really looked at it. And so that's one reason I'm interested in it. And also to explain where this stuff is coming from. it's coming from a lot of industrial activity. So if you're driving your car, it is coming from directly from the emissions from your car. It is literally the burning of your fossil fuels is going into the air, and we're breathing that in. And when you're burning this fossil fuel, so you're burning, let's say, I'm just going to make this short. You're burning butane for some reason. I don't know why you're burning butane. It's not just pure butane. It's butane and all these other little chemicals that were mixed with it. So it could be that magnesium, calcium. We don't really refine it super well. So what if there was a heavy metal in it? So what if there was arsenic in there? So then you're going to be breathing in that arsenic. Aside from these anthropogenic sources, there are also natural ones that can influence human health. Interestingly, like China, out in the desert there, they have a ton of PM 2.5. Now that's coming from like dust. So since it's coming from all this dust, you're breathing it in, and those have a very different chemicals and microbial signature than the ones in urban areas. I don't really care about the ones out in the desert in China. I live in a city, and the majority of people live in cities. This podcast is about cities, so we're going to talk about the ones in cities.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. So I now am looking at what is the microbial community composition of all of these things, as well as what are the selective pressures. Like if, let's say, okay, imagine a sphere and it's made of carbon and metals and all these other little things. Like imagine a little planet Earth, but things are stratified. So different areas of it have different chemical compositions. Maybe the left side of it has more metals than the right side. I want to know, are the microbes that are living on that and interacting with it, is the identity and their function being determined by the concentration of these particles, as well as the chemical composition of them? Because there's this really, really interesting thing about whether or not microbial communities are determined either we say stochastically, randomly, which is essentially saying they're determined by something, but we don't know what's going on. Or is it deterministic, determined by the concentrations and chemical makeup of these particles and other like meteorological things? So that is one thing I'm focusing on, because a lot of these particles have microbes attached to them, but we don't know what they're doing. But they're there and we're breathing them.
Yeah, seems like we should probably know what they're doing.
Yes. Yeah. I realized that I did not define microbes.
Yeah,
So
I was
I was
actually
saying,
just about to
yeah.
bring that up. Yeah, could you tell us what are microbes?
Yeah. So microbes are, or bugs, I call them sometimes, are the catch-all term for microorganisms, including things called bacteria, archaea, and fungi or fungi. We're not getting into that debate. And sometimes viruses are included, and you can sometimes include amoebas, but I mostly focus on these things called bacteria, archaea, and fungi, which super tiny. They influence everything. They're the reason why you have the food on your table. They fix nitrogen. They influence biogeochemistry. Obviously, they influence human health. A lot of them are, not a lot, I take that back. Some of them are pathogens. I want everyone to, at least if they come away from one thing from this, know that microbes are not bad. Some of them are pathogens, and then basically they do everything, and they're everywhere. So I've been studying them out in the air here. I've studied them in soils, and I've just started a project where I'm studying them in subway systems.
You mentioned earlier about how there's some stratification across the city. I'm wondering, well, you were talking specifically about how there's like some socioeconomic stratification of people across the city, and I was wondering whether there's also stratification of air quality across the city, where it's worse, where it's best, and whether if there are differences across the city in air quality, does that line up with differences of socioeconomic variables?
So that is a great question. I actually just published my first paper with some people, essentially looking at this and seeing. I did most of the data analysis, but my lab had walked around 4 different neighborhoods of Philadelphia: Center City, Tioga, Northern Liberties, and what was the other one? Chestnut Hill. So it varied a lot. So we had one, Center City's a lot of wealthier people, and then there's Tioga, low income, Northern Liberties, young yuppies, basically the Williamsburg of Philadelphia, and then Chestnut Hill, rich old white people. So we wanted to see if there's a difference based off all these social factors, and we did find there are significant differences both by the days, but also by location. So interestingly, we found out by Chestnut Hill, where it's a lot of wealthy white individuals living out there. There was higher particulate matter counts there, as well as black carbon, which black carbon is, again, to remind people, part of the fine particulate matter, but we wanted to look at them kind of as like holistically, and then specifically the black carbon. So we did find that, as well as lower counts of this in the lower socioeconomic areas, which was in our study Tioga. So that is not a panacea. It's not saying that low socioeconomic areas are going to have better air quality. We then go in, and this is the best part of science. We actually write a story about what's happening. We then looked at how many people are driving their cars, what's going on in these areas, and we found a lot more people are driving their cars in the wealthier white neighborhood, as opposed to the people in the lower income neighborhood, which take a lot more public transportation. And to kind of counter that, to make what I just said sound completely false, there is another neighborhood in Philadelphia that I am now focusing on. Well, it's in the greater Philadelphia area, called Chester County. It's like 100 miles around it. It's all the trash is brought to this one incinerator there, and so a lot of trash is being burned, and it's producing a lot of fine and coarse particulate matter. And you can just imagine the different kinds of chemicals that are in trash. I mean, people throw away batteries, like lithium's going in the air. People are, please don't throw away your batteries. And so I'm trying to connect and see if I can find higher rates of cancer and asthma in this area, and then write something up to send to the city, be like, hey, are you aware that you are one? It's kind of hard. We can't really say, let me rephrase that. We don't know whether or not the location of this trash incinerator and the subsequent health issues it's causing by burning all this trash and releasing all this pollution, whether or not that's determining where lower socioeconomic classes can live because rent prices are lower there, or if the fact that the rent prices were lower over there, that the incinerator was built there and then they've continued to be lower, and if they actually built the incinerator in a predominantly non-white neighborhood with low socioeconomic class, with low bachelor degrees and low rates of insurance and high asthma. We're trying to figure that all out. And so in addition to looking at that from the chemical aspect, which is the most, this isn't the proper word, but we're going to go ahead and say traditional way, I want to look at this also from the microbial way. Are there more pathogens in these lower socioeconomic areas as opposed to the richer areas? And how is that and what is the stratification of the relative abundance of all of the taxa and their functional genes based off of these social classes, spatially and temporally?
So when you say functional genes, what do you mean?
Yeah, oh, great question. Okay, so imagine a circle, and I had mentioned there's a little, and that circle is your whole genome. And this is like a microbe genome. You have one little snippet that codes for that ribosome I talked about. You have another one that codes for, I don't know, making DNA. And then the rest of it can do all these other things, and that's all really transportable between each other. Microbes, if they touch each other, they exchange genes. So these functional genes that they're exchanging and that make up the majority of their genome are essentially snippets of DNA that are transcribed and translated into proteins that will change the environment. So studies are now beginning to suggest and show that the microbes in the air might be metabolizing carbon. So they're eating the sugars that are in the air. So I'm just going to use carbon and sugar interchangeably. Given the fact that they're doing this, we don't know really how much they're doing it, and like what frequency they're doing it at. And then I'm also interested in, remember how I said there were all these heavy metals that might be in the air? Certain microbes are able to take these heavy metals and essentially do this thing called chelate, or immobilize them and make them less toxic, or sometimes more toxic. And so let's just use arsenic, for example. I found counts of arsenic out by Temple University. Don't worry, they're low, you're fine. But there are also very specific clades and taxa in the microbial world that are able to take this arsenic and make it less toxic. So there's many different ways that this research can be helpful. You could then be like, okay, cool. We found a lot of arsenic in the air, so we should release certain microbes in the air to make this part of the city healthier, and then help both the health of the city as well as the individuals living there and the people working there. And one other thing that I'm really interested in is putting cities in the context of climate change. So climate change is happening, and there's a lot more carbon being released into the air. There's a lot more sugar being released in the air. How is that changing the microbial communities? Are there going to be greater concentrations of microbial communities? And then if there are greater concentrations of them, does the type of sugar that's in the air determine what the identity of the microbe is, or the functional gene? Does it mean does greater concentrations of CO2 mean that more microbes that have genes that encode for diseases will be in the air? So we don't really know what's going on. And I think that determining this will be an integral part of air pollution within probably 20 years. People are going to realize that the effects of bioremediation that we can have based off these microbes.
Yeah, I wonder. So you mentioned earlier about how you want to share some of your data with the city. I wonder if you already have experiences interacting with city officials, whether you could share with us your general impressions about how interested they are in microbes specifically in the air, as opposed to air quality, like more broadly.
Yeah, that's a great question. I am still working on my thesis. I have code running away right now, so I am not at the point where I can be sharing it all to them. Although I am going in, well, fingers crossed that my abstract gets accepted to the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco, where I'm going to be presenting my data to a lot of people. It's like something like 25,000 people go to this conference. It's absurd. And so that's where I will be interacting with people who are at the EPA and other government agencies, as well as other academics and researchers. And it's really where you get your information out. And the end part of my thesis that I'm still trying to figure out how to do this most appropriately is science communication about what I do. Right now, I try to use social media as a good platform for it. Interestingly, like meme culture. I try to make like science meme culture a thing. But city officials from other cities were really interested in my research when I was at the Ecological Society of America in August. I was talking about it. And so I do have some EPA people. Dustin Herman specifically is really interested in this kind of research. But it's really difficult to translate these findings. That's the main problem with microbial ecology. There's such a learning curve, and it's hard to give like a elevator speech about it. So that's something that I'm trying to work on really hard. And I'm organizing, some symposia with people to figure out how to better communicate these findings. So like Kelly Ramirez, she and I are working on the symposium of how to be a good microbial ecologist in the future. We can't just keep doing the science and then not telling people about it, or just
Right.
telling people who have access behind these paywalls about it. So I'm trying to figure out a good public outreach program for this. My lab is going to talk to some middle and high school students soon, and I'm hoping to join them with that. I just can't think of a good interactive activity about things that they can't see.
Yeah, that is tricky. I wonder. I think I get the impression that this particular aspect, like communicating your science to practitioners and stakeholders, is probably particularly difficult for people studying microbes, because I think that probably the general population might have a negative perception of microbes. They may think about microbes as these dirty things, pathogens causing harm. Think about bacteria. People a lot of times think about bacteria as being these
Mm-hmm.
little things. So I wonder. You mentioned earlier about like, oh well, you could potentially introduce these microbes that improve air quality into like these problem areas of the city. It seems like that would be a pretty tough sell for people that maybe don't know a lot about microbes. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
your point about wanting to improve the way that we communicate about this, I think is really important, because I think microbes maybe need like a public image makeover.
They definitely do. I mean, I'm the only microbial ecologist in the Villanova community right now, and that my professor and the other people I work with, I tell them about microbes and they're like, "Oh my gosh, that's so gross." The amount of men who will message me on Tinder and be like, oh my gosh, that's so gross. You work with microbes. Aren't you grossed out by everything? I'm like, no. I'm like, they're there doing things for me. I'm very happy. I'm like, what'd you have for dinner today? If you had any vegetable, the farmer probably inoculated the soil with microbes and like used microbe probiotics in soil. You're fine. We need a public ambassador. We need a, like, the more you know, like one of those things from the early 2000s, one of those PSAs about microbes for sure.
or some sort of cute microbe mascot to be
Oh
the
my
public
gosh,
face.
yes. They do have microbe plush stuffed animals, and I really, really want the salmonella one.
Well, fingers crossed that somebody listens to this podcast and sends you a bunch of salmonella
Yes, please send
Munchkins.
me salmonella, please. Thank you.
Um, yeah, so you mentioned interest in climate change and microbes, and one of the things that we talk about in the show a lot is extreme events. And as you're well aware, extreme events are being influenced by climate change. So could you talk a little bit about how extreme events like floods, heat waves, and drought, how that might affect air quality and or microbial communities?
Oh my gosh, so excited. Okay, so the let's start with the air quality, although microbes are part of the air quality in my opinion. So floods aren't going to really affect the air quality, except from shifting it at the low surface level. They will the particles are able to dissolve, like if there's more water moving in the air. Heat waves, wow, that's the one that's going to affect the ozone. So that's where a lot of that anthropogenic ozone that I mentioned that can cause like lung scarring and asthma, that definitely will increase that, because these nitrogen, we call them NOx and SOx, nitrogen and sulfur compounds, interact with sunlight and they produce PM 2.5 and ozone. So greater concentrations of thermal energy will directly, will not linearly, but will directly increase the concentration of these pollutants. Drought is something that's not as much affecting it, just because these are all in the air and they're already incredibly desiccated, except if we're talking about, actually, I take this back. So a lot of microbes and this particulate matter will be these nucleating effects for clouds. So imagine, like, one microbe's in the air and then another one attaches to it. Then that attaches to a piece of particulate matter that was emitted from a car. And then clouds will begin to form around this. So it's more like the concentration of the particulate matter will be affecting might be able to affect drought and precipitation more than the drought and precipitation affecting the pollution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And then one last thing that is really interesting is something like, let's say there's a massive storm that is heavily going to change it. It's going to deposit these particles as well as these microbes from the atmosphere down onto the earth. So that's why one reason it's better to know what's in there, because if you live in an area where there's a lot of frequent rain, like that's why they did this study in Colorado. Also, the lab was based in Colorado, that one I mentioned earlier from Bowers. They have rain quite frequently up in the mountains, so the specific chemical species and the identity of the microbes in the air are a little bit more pertinent in areas where there's going to be frequent rain. In addition, if there's like a large storm that has been influenced by something like solar radiation, that is definitely going to shift the communities deterministically by literally moving them, as well as the particles. So that when they've nucleated, and the clouds begin to move, they're transporting them very far. I mean, that as well as wind are some of the biggest things that are affecting us. So the source appointment of some of these particles comes from, well, I won't speak about Philadelphia for this because they haven't actually studied this as much, but an example would be the Sahara Desert seeds the microbial communities in the Amazon, for example, because it's brought over by wind, and changes in the climate might be changing these long-term patterns of stuff we know. Like there's these things called Hadley cells. It might be shifting the dynamics of these Hadley cells, which are these turning areas of wind and such in the air that kind of determine where deserts will be. So they'll be at like 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. If these Hadley cells are moved because of climate change, it's going to be affecting the biodiversity of plants all around the world, as well as ecosystem functioning. And by doing that, you're also going to be changing the air pollution and air quality. So it's also connected. And I do want to explain that I am not 100%, I don't know everything about all of this, but there's a lot of really great dust researchers who do research this. Sujith Ravi at Temple University is one really great person if anyone's interested in dust.
Great, thank you. That was a really good answer. Coming back then to thinking about Philadelphia and the city itself and how air quality is changing in the city, what are some initiatives that the city's taken to address air quality?
This is going to sound bad, but really none. From my thesis proposal, I hadn't really found much that we'd been doing aside from trying to adhere better to the Clean Air Act. But that was like the 1970s, I think, or late 60s. So it's changed a lot with politics because, if there's more funding for the EPA, they can afford to have more people go out and check sites. But Philly isn't doing a very good job on it. We only have like, I want to say somewhere from like 1 to 3 EPA monitoring sites in the whole Philadelphia area, not just the greater Philadelphia area, so larger than the county, which if people don't really know where Philly is, we're right next to New Jersey and Delaware, and we're like 100 miles from New York City, but there's not, so we're in the middle of one of the most densely populated areas in the country, and I'm going to go ahead and say the world, but we're not monitoring it very well. And so since we're not monitoring it well, we don't know how to adhere to it better. And the city honestly needs to be putting more funding into, it's not even a ton of funding. It's like $10,000. And that'll be to have more stations so we know what's going on with finer resolution. So Philly isn't doing that much. So any Philly officials listening, hey, let's talk.
Well, that's a bit concerning. So I guess as an individual, what can people do to help protect themselves from unhealthy air?
So stay indoors. Actually, that doesn't always mean the air can be bad inside too. So I do want to debunk a myth real quick. So you'll see people wear the like little masks.
Yeah.
And they'll say, oh, it's good to stop PM 2.5. Doesn't work. So many studies show that the majority of them don't work. You have to buy a really expensive one if you want it to work. So that's not going to help. But I honestly would say, think about where your carbon emissions are coming from. I walk everywhere and take the train. I have left my car in Texas, and it's majority here. The people here use public transit. If you have the option to use public transit, you will be reducing the concentration of fine particulate matter and ozone or anthropogenic ozone, and you might be shifting the microbial communities in a better way. Aside from that, I would say think of it not as just yourself from unhealthy air, think of it globally. Again, this is going back to carbon. I highly suggest buying carbon offsets if you fly a lot or trying to take the train. I'm going to Boston for a PhD interview next week. And instead of flying, I'm spending like $20 more to take the Amtrak. That's going to take 6 hours, but it's better for the environment. And, take the train, read your book, have a nice gin and tonic. You don't need to get everywhere fast.
That's a great place to sort of end our conversation.
Right?
A call to action, and to treat yourself with a nice gin and tonic.
Yes.
All right. So I have asked you to prepare a haiku about your research. Are you ready to share it?
I am. Okay, but I want to let everyone know I spent so much time trying to make it the equally nerdy and not nerdy, so I just went sweet and simple. Bacteria, my love, you keep us alive. Thank you. Keep on being you.
Wonderful. Simple, easy to understand. Love it.
Yeah.
Love it. Great. That's pretty much all the stuff that I wanted to talk about. Is there anything else that you'd like to plug?
Yeah, I definitely want to say if you want to follow any of my research, follow me on Instagram at the Crobe, like the microbe, but just take off the my. Other than that, find my email at Villanova and let's collaborate. Let's do some cool science.
Yeah, let's do some cool science. All right. Thank you so much for joining us, Justin. It's a really fun conversation. Really appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
And thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time. The Future Cities podcast is an outreach effort brought to you by the Urban Resilience to Extremes Sustainability Research Network, or UREX as we usually refer to it. To learn more about UREX, visit www.sustainability.asu.edu/urban resilience. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future episodes, you can email us at futurecitiespodcast@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at FutureCitiesPod. If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.